I'm going to welcome our ambassadors and Carol Kane to the podium. You're welcome to take a seat. Thank you. And thank you to everybody who's joined us here today, and welcome to Oakland University. We are so proud to be a venue for public discussions about the issues that we are facing today, issues that shape our world, like tonight's discussion, which has been front and center as a topic in shaping American foreign policy for decades. I'd now like to take just a moment to thank Professor Michael Pitlick, Sis Maisel, and the Sis Maisel Center for Judaic Studies and Community Engagement for their support of tonight's event. And on behalf of the Oakland community, I'd like to extend our deep appreciation to Oakland University alum and prominent Metro Detroit attorney, William Swore, for his generous support for tonight's fascinating discussion. And of course, I'd like to thank you, Dave Dulio. Dave, please stand for a moment. Thank you. Professor Dulio is the director of our Center for Civic Engagement. Dave has done an absolutely outstanding and amazing job in elevating public discourse while remaining true to a nonpartisan approach that places understanding and the public's best interests at the center of our shared discussions. Dave, I really want to personally thank you because you are always committed and passionate about what we do here at Oakland University. And I personally also want to thank Carol Kane. Carol's our moderator tonight, and she's one of our finest and most incisive journalists here in Michigan. Thank you, Carol. Now, tonight is really a remarkable example of how each one of us can do so much more than just imagine a better world. We can do more than just dream that it's possible. Theodor Herzl once said, "Im tirtzu, ein zo agada." If you wish it, it is not a fairy tale. It starts with each one of us being knowledgeable, having a better understanding of our world, of our common differences, but also of what we share and what we have in common. So tonight, we're fortunate to have the most remarkable of guests here with us, those who have certainly done their part to turn a fairy tale into reality. Our panelists who played key roles in the Abraham Accords understood and continue to understand what is needed and what is at stake in the ongoing efforts to bring peace and cooperation to the Middle East. Ambassador Fischer and Ambassador Rakolta, we are so pleased that you are with us here tonight, and we are so appreciative of your work in the pursuit of a lasting peace in a region that has suffered from centuries of war. And yet it is a region bound by a common geography, and as the name of the Accords makes clear, a common spiritual and religious forefather, Abraham, the patriarch of Islam, the patriarch of Judaism, and the patriarch of Christianity. The Abraham Accords were announced in a joint statement on August 13th, 2020, from the United Arab Emirates, Israel, and the United States. The Accords marked the first public normalization between an Arab country and Israel since the 1994 agreement between Jordan and Israel. And in a few minutes, we will hear the ambassadors discuss their views about the chances for long-lasting peace in the Middle East. But for a moment, just think about why this discussion is so very important and impacts us every day, including today. For more than a month, we've witnessed the horrific war in Ukraine. We've heard and we've seen the stories of refugees, the humanitarian disaster, and the plight of Ukrainian people who are standing up for self-determination against unprovoked aggression. Our ethos as a nation is shaped by our responses to the events that challenge our values here in America and around the world. What happens in Ukraine matters. What happens in the Middle East matters. We must think clearly about the conflicts that are around the world, their causes, and the possibility of resolving conflicts because of our identity and our purpose as a nation, because that is at stake for all of us. A geopolitical strategic case can be made about America's foreign policy, but each of us must ask, what is right? What is just? And what can be done in the name of peace? And remember, if you will it, it is not a fairy tale. And it is within that context that we invite tonight's distinguished guests to share their experiences with us, their expertise, and their wisdom. And now it is my great privilege to invite Oakland University's Board of Trustees Chair, Bobby Shostak, who's actually right there on that screen, to introduce our ambassadors. Welcome, Chair Shostak.
Thank you, Dr. Pesovitz, and good evening, everybody. I want to begin also by thanking Dr. Dulio, because his Center for Civic Engagement is what makes this possible. And there have been so many wonderful programs through the department that we are really grateful for. So thank you, David, for all your work on our behalf. Tonight, as Dora said, we have three distinguished guests joining us for this discussion. Leading the discussion is Detroit Free Press columnist and a good friend, CBS show Michigan Matters host, Carol Kane, now in its 14th year. Carol has hosted interviews and discussions with leaders of industry, leading elected officials from both parties, numerous sports legends, business and philanthropic leaders, such as our two guests here this evening, and many folks from around Michigan and throughout the United States. Joining us also are two distinguished business and community leaders and good friends of mine, David Fischer and John Rakolta. By way of a bit of background on ambassadors, Michigan has had for several decades presidential appointments to high levels of positions in the United States government. We've been blessed in that regard that so many have come from Michigan, including secretaries in the presidential cabinet, ambassadors, but ambassadors to nations highly sensitive to our national security. But to date, no one has been at the center of the political, economic, foreign policy discussion at the levels of what materialized in September of 2020, when the historic Abraham Accords were negotiated and ultimately several Mideast nations signed an accord, a historic accord with the state of Israel, something that had been tried for decades unsuccessfully. John Rakolta Jr. as the ambassador to the United Arab Emirates, and David Fischer Jr. as the ambassador to Morocco were at the absolute ground zero of this historic event. They both served as appointed ambassadors by then President Trump. Both were confirmed by the United States Senate in the fourth quarter of 2019, but immediately went to work on these historic, groundbreaking agreements that brought not just peace agreements, but economic partnership and collaboration, as well as regional security to all the nations of the Gulf states and Israel. The impossible, not just a few years ago, but even months before, was put in place. Truly remarkable. Well, enough from me right now. Let me turn the program over to Carol Kane, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Bobby. So, Bobby, I want to make 2 corrections before we begin. So, it's David Fischer, Senior. Junior?
There is no senior.
Not Fischer, okay, Junior. Okay.
No, that's David Jr. Would you stand up?
Stand up.
That's David Fisher Jr.
And you're just David Fischer. Okay, now we've got that straight. And Michigan Matters is now in its 17th year officially as of, so, here we go. As of Saturday, 17 years ago, Michigan Matters started as a weekly show. It was a 4-week election special and did really well, so they continued it. And so, anyways, we digress. So, good evening. It's so nice to be here with everybody. It's so nice to see faces live. I think this might be my first in-person event. I've moderated tons of Zoom events and gatherings, but it's so nice to see live people. And I'm looking around the room here, and in 17 years, probably half the audience has been on the show or have written about them at the Free Press. So it's so good to see you. And I'm welcoming people there who are tuning in via live stream. Good evening. Nice to have everybody there. And Mr. Ambassadors, it is so great to be with you here, talking about this, which in light of everything going on, this is so important. And this conversation about civility and politics and making a difference, you two have been at the forefront of this in amazing ways over the last couple years. And I wrote a column Sunday, and the headline of my column was, how did 2 guys from Detroit running major corporations end up at the Middle East peace process? Well, you're going to hear some of the answers here tonight. So thank you both again for agreeing to talk with us and share some of your insight. So we're going to dive in on the big topic tonight, the Abraham Accords. But before we do, you both served in an incredible position serving our country as U.S. ambassadors, and that's not something that most of us will ever even come close to. Hearing you talk about it is as close as most of us will get. So can you talk a little bit about that experience and what that was like? And Mr. Ambassador, would you like to go first?
Well, first of all, it's an honor to be here. It's an honor to be here with you, and certainly with John and Terry Rakolta, who have been dear friends of mine for, I think it's been 40 years, 45 years, almost before Junior came around, but not quite. So my pleasure at being here at Oakland University actually goes back. We all do many things in life, along with working, along with raising a family. One of these great memories for me is 16 years at Oakland University. So among the other things I got to do in my life was spend 16 years here because we want to be a member of the community. We want to be part of what's happening. How do we steer it the right way? How do we make sure that we have done our part? And Doctor, thank you so much for making sure these things, these events get to happen and we get to do it with real people now. I think to say we were politically appointed ambassadors. And when you think of that, there's about 40 a year, 40 in the term of a presidency. So if you think of yourself as one of 40 in a country of 300 million, what are the odds? How does that happen? And it's the stars and the sun and the moon, everything lines up. And you don't get to say, I'd like to do this. The typical way it's done is you're asked, if we ask you, what would you say? They don't like to come out and put themselves in a bad position. And that in itself can be such an honor. Serving our country was truly an honor. I had no idea how big an honor until I was in country representing our country to the Kingdom of Morocco. And as I told you earlier, you are really not an accredited diplomat in a country until you present your credentials. So you have a set for the head of government, king, foreign minister, whatever the head of government is. You have a set for the foreign minister, and then you have a souvenir set. So after presenting my credentials on the first day I was in country, which is quite rare, but the king wanted to make that happen for the United States of America. Pardon me. We then went back to the house. We raised the flag saying that we were in residence at our home. And I'm doing that with our Marine Guard and a band playing. And my wife Jennifer and I were looking up at the flag going up and thinking, oh my God, this is real. It's here. It's taken us a little while to get here. But this is truly one of the great moments of my life. And from there on, you're just on a really fast track.
Interesting. Ambassador Rakolta?
Well, first let me say how honored I am to have been invited to participate in this. And in the interest of time, I'm going to save all of the other platitudes for afterward and try to get into some of the meat and not repeat what David has just said. I experienced all the same things that he did. And I think the question pertained to, how did it happen? And you really can divide become an ambassador and your ambassadorship into several sectors. The first is positioning yourself within your party that not only are you loyal, you're learned, you get things done, and to a certain degree, the president knows you. The president's going to want to surround himself with people who think similar to him, but not exactly like him. And we can get into what it was like to work for President Trump, because I met with him quite often. The second thing is the journey, I call it. And once you are asked to serve, there is a journey like no other journey that I have ever taken in my entire life. I equate it to somewhat like pledging a fraternity to some degree. There's Hell Week that you have to go through, except in David, in my case, Hell Week turned into Hell 2 years as they fought over our nominations in the Senate quite vociferously and quite rudely, I think. Then once you get in, it's learning the job, and that takes about 60 days. You don't realize, as David said, the enormity and the authority that you have as an ambassador. The ambassador speaks on behalf of the president. You have, by law, the authority to sign on behalf of the United States of America. And you're told in ambassador school that you can even sign a declaration of war if you are so inclined. Of course, nobody does that today, but you can think 100 or 200 years ago, when we didn't have this instant communication, how ambassadors acted. Once you learn and experience your authority, then you start looking around for things that you can solve. And one of the great things about political ambassadors is if you compare a political ambassador to a State Department career officer, and I have the utmost respect for them. They are taught diplomacy from the earliest of getting out of school, and it takes them 30 years to rise to the level of being selected as a chief of mission. But what advantage that we have over them is, number one, political ambassadors are far more capable and willing to take risk. And maybe we can talk about that a little bit later, because nothing is solved easily. There is a manual called the FAM, Foreign Affairs Manual, and there's basically a recipe how to answer every single question. And I can give you a crash course right now. The recipe is no. Okay? Nobody in the State Department really wants to take any risk, because your career could get sideways very, very quickly by making a wrong decision. Whereas for David and I, if wrong decision would meant we go back home and go back to our great country, our great community, and our great companies. And so that's number one. But more important than that is your access to the White House. And this is where political ambassadors shine, because after all, David and I knew the Secretary of State, the Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of Homeland Security, Secretary of Commerce, and the thing goes on and on and on. And you don't realize how valuable that is until somebody in the bureaucracy says to you, no. And you say, well, I'm not taking no for an answer. And then you start to find workarounds. And the best workaround is just go to the head of the Secretary of State. And of course, you don't do this too often, but everybody in post knows that. And pretty soon they start to conform to what you want to do. Finally, the best part of the job is you're interfacing with the foreign government. And David and I both were able to engage with the royal family, us, the royal family of the UAE, MBZ, TBZ, ABZ, three brothers who basically run the UAE. And it took a while for them to warm up to us. And both of our wives, and I want to give credit to our wives because I don't believe we would have made the kind of success without my wife. And I want her to just stand up for a minute, okay? And if Jennifer Fischer is by and large on watching this on the Zoom, I want to also congratulate her because I know she was a great asset to David. In my wife's case, she showed the UAE and my embassy what soft power was all about. And maybe we could talk a little bit about the difference between soft power and hard power. That, in a nutshell, is what you experience, and it is the greatest job in the world. And if you ever wanted to be a rock star, and you can't because you don't have the talent, become an ambassador, because no matter where you go, somebody's recording you, somebody wants your signature, somebody wants your picture, you're in a armored personnel carrier with a bunch of troops protecting you all the time, which is great for about 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and then you realize that you've lost your freedom. But it is the greatest job I've ever had, and you won't have to ask me the question at the end, if invited again, would you serve? And the answer would be absolutely.
If Joe Biden had asked you, would you have served?
Joe Biden did ask us, and we said yes.
We were actually both asked, and they again they ask it. If we ask, would you stay? Yes, I would. What would you do? We wrote an agreement. We put it in place. I was going to stay till the end of May. John's may have been the same thing. This is what I'm going to work on. And January 12th, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I get a email that said, we have accepted your resignation. Thank you for your service. And I went, I never wrote a resignation. Evidently, they were, it was time.
Yeah.
So
the job of being an ambassador and what you're both talking about is so riveting and so fascinating. I guess it begs the question, what was the most challenging part of the job itself? What was the toughest part of this? And Mr. Ambassador Rakolta?
Getting confirmed. It took me 897 days to get confirmed. And you go through a process, a 14-step process. Part of it was fun when the FBI went and interviewed 150 people to see what I might have done wrong in my lifetime that would disqualify me. It was not fun filling out the financial disclosure and coming to agreement on the ethics agreement. It was fun going and seeing other Republican senators who fully supported your nomination regardless of almost anything. And vice versa, when we went and saw the Democrats who almost universally condemned your nomination. I do want to give a shout out to Senator Stabenow and Senator Peters, who supported us from the very beginning. In my case, Senator Stabenow carried some very heavy water for me. And so that confirmation process took far too long. It's broken within our country. President Biden today has even fewer ambassadors in place than President Trump did. And at some point in time, our country is going to have to deal with, it is not a good idea to have 40 or 50 embassies without the ambassador there trying to conduct foreign policy. We as a country have to come together in spite of our differences, be able to compromise, not defend every single time somebody comes after you, listen respectfully, compromise, and find some middle ground that we can make an agreement. So that confirmation process to me was the most difficult part. There were days when I despaired that I wasn't going to go any farther and I'd put all this effort into it. But David and I had a pact, and that was if you ever were going to quit and withdraw, the first call before you decided it had to be to each other, because one of us would say, you're not quitting. I'm not quitting, you're not quitting. We had this blood brother pact from the very beginning.
never, ever quit. But I would have to echo John's comments. Without the support and the active participation and help from our two Democratic senators in Michigan, Senator Stabenow, Senator Peters, we wouldn't have gotten to country. And they did it at some peril to themselves, because the leadership, as one of the staffers from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee put it, is that we want scalps on the wall. We just want to turn you down. Doesn't care why. We just don't want. We're gonna stall this as long as we can. And what happens in many countries, if they don't have an equivalent person to talk to, if the foreign ministers don't have a foreign minister level person to talk to, nothing happens. They will not talk to lower staffers. We weigh in on everything from treaties, as we mentioned, to arms purchases. No arms will be purchased. It won't come out of the embassy unless an ambassador approves the request. I don't care if you're buying bullets or F-35s. That work has to be done, and without an ambassador in place, it doesn't get done properly. It's really for them to win, I have to lose. And we really need, you'll hear probably a lot of this discussion from us tonight. We have to find a way through that.
So have ambassadors been, your replacements named yet?
No. The process is you get picked quietly. It's not the secret, but it's near the public. After you go through the first 5 or 6 steps, then they have a process of an announcement. Many people confuse the announcement with the nomination. It is not. The announcement is the last step to being vetted. The White House will send out a public announcement that says, Ambassador Fischer has been, the president intends, and that's the important word, intends on nominating. Didn't nominate yet, and they let that sit out there for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, or however long it takes, and now the public starts to comment. So if you have some past that is going to get exposed, they wait for that to come in, and then they evaluate it, or they might even investigate it, and then they do the nomination and send one little slip of paper on a 3x5 card to the Senate saying, I nominate Ambassador John Rakolta to be the ambassador. And so, that is this process that takes place.
So is there an ambassador to UAE and also to Morocco right now?
No, they haven't even gotten to the announcement stage. And somebody in the State Department, I heard in my case that they're fighting between the political ambassador and internally between the political ambassador and
You want to talk about
career
that?
Ambassador.
The fact that you were the first.
Yes, I was the first political ambassador ever to the UAE. The State Department was unhappy about it. They became a fly in the ointment, if you will, in terms of my confirmation. They didn't want it to happen. And it took me about 60 days to get the post to finally convince them that I knew what I was doing. I had a lot of experience at dealing international. I was the honorary general counsel for Romania here in the United States for 20 years, had been involved in their ascension to NATO and getting into the EU. So it wasn't like I was totally unexperienced, but the UAE wanted a political ambassador. They wanted a political ambassador because the national security interest of the UAE is their economy and is their tremendous wealth. And the State Department wants to see that go back to career, and of course the administration wants it to be a political, and nobody knows where we are right now. I think it's deeper than that. The Biden administration didn't fully support the Abraham Accords, if you will. Actually put out a memo the first day in office saying that anybody in the State Department was not allowed to use the word Abraham Accords. It was a Trump victory. They didn't want to support any Trump victories. But in all fairness to them, they did allow some movement in terms of normalization between Israel and the UAE.
In Morocco's case, they named a gentleman probably 10 days ago kind of the trial balloon, a longtime State Department person. They're trying to turn these back to the State Department. And the countries that we were in don't want that. The countries that we are in want an ambassador. They need an ambassador. They have to have somebody to talk to. Mm-hmm. And it won't happen for a while.
I just might point out that each country has the opportunity to say yes or no, and they call that agrément. It's a French word for agreement. And it isn't unheard of for countries to say no. And it's going to be interesting, in at least my country, the UAE, what will happen, whether they will have the fortitude to say no to somebody they don't want, or whether they'll capitulate. And by the way, it goes without saying, the power of the United States in an international basis and in country is enormous. There is no country that rivals our country in terms of its cultural influence, its soft power, its economic power, the amount of intelligence that we collect on a global basis, and of course our military, which is second to none in the whole world.
So we're starting to get some audience questions here. One of the questions is, do you get paid for being an ambassador? What do you get?
Not well. I think it's safe to say that we took pay cuts to go there. They do pay you, but then again, you pay a lot of expenses. We probably spent more money on the house than they paid me. You know. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure about that.
Ambassador Rakolta, want to add to that? Wait, can I show this first?
Yeah, go right ahead.
These are, what do you call these?
Challenge points.
Challenge coins, which you have a number of these, and they're beautiful. And these are, you hand these out to?
Yeah, they're medals, basically. And each ambassador has the opportunity to design and strike various challenge coins that represent their successes and themselves and their philosophy.
Yeah.
And they're almost like a business card. When you go to meet a new minister-level person, the first thing you give them is your challenge coin. And they look at it, and you've designed it yourself with your motto and some connection between their country. And they work quite effectively. And so I was fortunate to be in one of the most dynamic countries that in the world during my time there. And we had three major issues that we were dealing with all simultaneously. The first was Expo 2020 Dubai, which is a giant World's Fair. Think of the Olympics, economic Olympics. We weren't going to participate. Congress failed to appropriate any money. The old funding mechanism was broken, and I was sent out there to basically tell the Emiratis, we're not coming. And that was the first thing. I was there 2 days, and I went and told them we're not coming. And they said, that's impossible. What is it going to take? And we sat around for a couple of days, sort of bantering back and forth, and they finally wrote us a check for $60 million. And there's a challenge coin that I made representing that victory and gave it to everybody in the embassy who helped me make that happen. Second challenge coin is on the strategic dialogue, which is a special way that we communicate with our host country. Not every country gets a strategic dialogue. It's only reserved for the best of friends that the United States has. We had never done a strategic dialogue. And I realized after 60 days that our communication with the UAE was at best stymied and stilted because we had, although been great allies, they had supported us in the Iraq War, in the Afghan War, and many other excursions. There were two things that we had done that had essentially made them upset. First was the signing of the nuclear deal with Iran, and the second was our definition of what a terrorist organization would look like as it would pertain to the Muslim Brotherhood. And so when I went out there, we weren't making much progress. I came back, met with the president and with the national security advisor, and said, we got a real problem with these guys. If we expect to make any progress, we're going to have to find a way to have a better dialogue. And they said, Mr. Ambassador, we're going to allow you to do something that we rarely let an ambassador do. We're going to let you conduct a strategic dialogue. I went back to the UAE, offered this up, and for the next 6 months, January of 2020 to June of 2020, we conducted, during full COVID, an intensive re-engagement with them on a very high-level basis and accomplished all kinds of things, including getting them to have one of the pillars about human rights, which is really big for an Arab country to do this. And so I got to strike a dialogue with them and ultimately signed the strategic dialogue agreement, if you will, and we struck a coin for that. That's what I gave to Carol. And then finally, the Abraham Accords. This is sort of a cute story. I was involved in the Abraham Accords. There was only 15 people that were involved. David and I were 2 of the 15. We were behind the scenes the whole time, could not tell the State Department anything about it. We were sworn to secrecy. And as a result of that, we were honored with a nice medal again for our hard work. And the White House wanted to strike this medallion, show that one to them. That's the blue one. I got a phone call sometime in early August and said, Mr. Ambassador, we have a little problem and we'd like to offer you a proposition. And this is the National Security Council deputy calling me about this. And he said, we want to strike 500 of those coins, but we have no way of paying for it because if we do, the leak will come out. We can't do this in-house. So we'd like you and Ambassador Friedman, who was the ambassador to Israel, to pay for it together. You pay half, he would pay half. We, the White House, are going to take 100 coins, and we're going to give each of you 200 for your troubles. And I sort of was laughing at myself that if it was a career ambassador, they wouldn't have been able to pay for them. It just wouldn't have been within their purview and within the kind of compensation that they got. And so you see this repeated many, many times as an ambassador about things that you can pay for on behalf of our government. So when you ask what the cost is to be an ambassador, it's threefold. One, your salary, while high, I would never say I was underpaid because it was such an honor to participate and to have that job. But the actual salary is minuscule compared to what you make as a private businessman. Money never drove us, and so that didn't become an issue. The second thing that you end up losing out on is that you have an ethics agreement and you have to sell stocks and bonds. You're not allowed to hold virtually anything that could be a conflict. And I actually had a lot of Apple and Amazon, stocks of those nature, had to sell them in the fall of 2019, and they've all like tripled. And so you look at that and you say, well, look at that amount that you've lost. And then the final thing is what David said, is that you get to pay for a lot of things that you don't get reimbursed for. But it never was about money. I'm not complaining one single bit. I was honored to serve, and I do it again tomorrow.
So, Ambassador Fischer, at its bare essence, and I know many people in the room are well aware of all the nuances, but I also am going to guess that there's a large percentage that vaguely know about the Abraham Accords but don't know specifics. At its bare essence, how do you describe what these treaties are?
It's complete and thorough recognition of each other. In Morocco's case, while they had a back channel over a number of years, there was no exchange of ambassadors, there was no direct flights, there were no ministerial meetings, there was very little commerce. It is a friend of John's put it, we pretty much ignored Israel for 50 years. And that just doesn't work. So under the Abraham Accords, there has been an exchange of ambassadors, opening of embassies, visits back and forth, free travel back and forth. And it is they're becoming a full and very important partner. If you think of who would want Israel on their side, their technology, their creativity, it's world class. It leads, and they have been unable to in the public eye to go and use that. Tourism is very important to Morocco. No Israeli tourists. Now we have tourists. So it is the refreshing of a relationship that is free and open.
This is an audience question here that kind of follows up with that, Ambassador Rakolta. How can the Abraham Accords have a positive impact on the Palestinian world?
The Abraham Accords is a simple, aspirational agreement that peace and prosperity is better than violence, war, and death. In its essence, that's what it is. And we can see today how important the difference is by what's happening in the Ukraine. What the Abraham Accords can bring to the Palestinians is fresh thinking on how they might sit down with the Israelis and negotiate a settlement. Something each side will have to compromise. The negotiations will be tough, but you will never get an agreement the way they're going today. They have to sit down to negotiate. And there are many artists and many cultural people who realize this. And I don't want to speak on behalf of either country, but the Palestinians have yet to want to sit down and negotiate. And my own view is that it will take a youth movement coming forth in the Palestine. Jared Kushner put forth the vision of peace, which really was the forerunner to the Abraham Accords, which was going to set economically the Palestinians free with tens upon tens upon tens of billions of dollars of investment in the West Bank to be able to jumpstart the Palestinian economy so people could have a good job, get a good education, have access to health care, to have access to opportunity. And until that negotiation starts, we'll see no progress.
You mentioned Jared Kushner. He obviously is the former president's son-in-law, was a special advisor to President Trump. He was nominated this past week or two for a Nobel Peace Prize again. It was a second time. Your thoughts about Jared Kushner and his prospects for winning a Nobel Peace Prize?
Well, without fresh and creative thinking in Washington, this never would have happened. The path to peace was always through Palestine and the West Bank. Under Jared, and Jared spent a lot of time working on this. He had a lot of help, and it's one of the things that John alluded to before. We worked for the White House. So we were brought into this at a certain level. The State Department, well, I believe Pompeo knew later, nobody knew. So we were working kind of as we were trying to do my piece of it. Mine came after the election that President Biden won. But Jared Kushner drove this process. And I first heard about it in Washington, and then it was reinforced on video conferences with Jared in a secure communications room. Without Jared, without the work he did, this wouldn't have happened.
Ambassador Rakolta, anything to add to that?
Well, this is the second time he was nominated. His first nomination didn't go anywhere. And I think that given the politics of the world today, that he has very little chance the second time of even getting past just the initial nomination.
So the accord that's been about 18 months, right, since it was. What do you hope as we look at the peace process moving forward, based on what we've seen over the last 18 months there? What's your hope for the peace process there now?
Well, I think that you need to look at what's happened between the UAE and Israel and take that as a marker of what can happen. So in the case of those two countries, 300,000 Israelis visited the UAE in the first 3 months of the signing of the peace accord. The economic benefit of that is just enormous. The trade between Israel and the UAE has expanded 20-fold from about $150 to $200 million a year to almost $3 billion in 2021. The amount of investment that's going back and forth is an unprecedented proportions. The UAE just committed $10 billion to invest in startups in the UAE. And when you look at why this is all happening, it's really quite simple. It's about each country's national security. And if you strip away the politics and understand that they both have a common interest, and that common interest is protecting themselves against Iran, one. Two, to build and integrate their economies in a way that they'll remain allies for a century or two or longer. That's two. And three, because they're so culturally similar, and this is what they found out, that from a cultural basis, whether it's art or film or literature or education, they're becoming much, much closer and bound together. And then finally, they have a common language, both Arabic and English, that they're able to get past just interpreting each other's statements. Now, when you look at the other Gulf countries, that's where my expertise comes in. Every one of those Gulf countries needs the same thing. They need to be able to present to their citizens hope for the future. And a good part of that is opportunity in getting a good paying job. And that's the hope. It's much better to do that than it is to go back to the Six-Day War or the War of 1972 or what's happening in Ukraine today. And by the way, it'll take hundreds of billions of dollars to put Ukraine back to where they were just before this started. And you just don't look at Ukraine, you can look at Syria. It's destroyed. Iraq, it's destroyed. Lebanon is destroyed, not from bombing, but from total mismanagement and corruption of their government. Libya was destroyed. Yemen is destroyed. I think the world has had enough of this, and we've got to find a way, keep on going back to this over and over and over and over again. You have to be bipartisan. You can't defend your position. You have to listen. You have to be willing to compromise. And I believe that unless our country makes a quick U-turn, we're headed for the same kind of problem.
When you think of what's happening in the Middle East now, they're really communicating in some level better than many other parts of the world. And they are quite pleased that they're communicating. To be able to watch the missile attacks that were going on into Israel last year and to be a part of the solution that the UAE was, as with Egypt and Jordan, and trying to bring peace to this region. They will participate in that discussion as opposed to stand back and just watch it unravel. We really need to find, and I know this sounds a little bit like kumbaya, but we need to find a way to talk to each other. And we need to do it sooner than later.
So I have a question here from an Oakland University student named Tanner. And the question is, what role does the UN play in the ongoing peace process? Should it take a more proactive, reactive, or uninvolved role in regional politics? One of these smart poli-sci students here.
I worked very little. We had a UN rep that didn't live in the Western Sahara, but he was in charge of it. He lived in the Spanish islands off the coast. It's another level of bureaucracy. And again, John's comment was right. These guys work hard. This is not easy work they do, but it is not, I'm used to going to work, having a problem, wanting to do something about it, and trying to get it done. Many of these conflicts are so old, they wear you out. And when you're dealing with people that don't want to deal with you because, God forbid, there might be some corruption in the system, and they're living their lives on that corruption, there's no reason for them. So in my case, I met with the UN people for the Western Sahara, but it was not, they had their hands full.
Anything?
I think the UN does a fairly good job as being a global aid agency, passing out billions of dollars where they're needed. They also do a very good job as being peacekeepers. They're trusted and given very, very high marks for that. When it comes to being the leading edge of conflict resolution, I don't think that that's the business that they see themselves in as much as they'd like to. You'd have to completely remake them to make that effective because of the power of the Security Council and the veto power that the major powers have. So anything that's controversial that involves the United States, Russia, or China, even this war where Russia is the perpetrator, they vetoed everything on the Security Council, which thus then makes there isn't anything that has any legal standing. So, they do a good job, as I said, but I don't think they're well equipped to solve the problems of the world.
Because we're running short on time, I'm going to ask you just quick questions and quick responses on things. So the obvious is, what do you think is going to happen in Ukraine going forward here? What happens here?
I think Russia eventually wakes up and says they've done themselves more damage than good, tries to find an exit. I think you saw the beginning of it today. We're going to sort of stop bombing Kiev and go back to the eastern part. There'll be a point in time where the president of Ukraine will want to cut his losses, and so will Putin. And whether that's in a week or a month, there'll end up being some kind of a settlement of some kind.
I think we saw the hatching of a new world leader in Zelensky. I think this man has done an amazing job. I think the fortitude and spirit of the Ukrainian people has been magnificent. They, as John said, they're going to live under hardship conditions for decades because of what's happened, and I hope the world doesn't forget that.
Other quick question here, a little bit closer to home when it comes to, we're here at the Center for Civic Engagement. We know we have two parties here in the country. A lot of interesting partisan conversations here, but can you think of any example here in our country where the two sides are working together on a meaningful effort of some sort? And
I want to move to West Virginia. I think we have seen hints of people working together, but when you go towards socialism, we're kind of going, we need more participation towards fixing, solving, doing than rhetoric.
You have to look really deep to find a place that bipartisanship is working well. I don't think it's in the social medias or drive-by media's best interest to talk about positive things. People want to move to the extremes. And so it takes us, people like us, to have the courage. This is where I hand it to the leaders of the UAE. They were the first ones to sign up all by themselves, never told anybody. And one day it was announced, August 13th, as you said, and they braced for what was going to happen in the Arab world. And many condemned them, but many didn't. And it's interesting in politics and in diplomacy how you read between the lines. It's a different speak than we're used to.
so what was the one thing in your background that helped you best prepare for your role as an ambassador? What one thing in your background?
For me, it was basically two things. It was being involved in all of the social issues in the city of Detroit. First, I was chairman of New Detroit that tried to deal with the race issue between the suburbs and the city of Detroit. And that really taught me a lot and opened my eyes about how someone who seemed to be an adversary was willing to go more than halfway to try to invoke some kind of dialogue to better understand. And it's a whole journey that I took for 10 years that prepared me. But I think the biggest thing was what we call the Coalition of the Future of Detroit School Children, and how the Detroit public school system was going bankrupt, and Lansing was controlled by Republicans, and I was invited into a coalition of the willing to try to do something to save the Detroit public school systems, and participating in all the trials and tribulations about how does a bipartisan group try to solve a problem of that magnitude on the heels of the bankruptcy of the city of Detroit. Those two things really opened my eyes that there is nothing that's impossible. That with the right will, the right faith, the right good nature, the right heart, the right honesty, integrity, we can solve anything as a society.
In my case, it was really having been on the entrepreneurial side. I had an understanding of what, with the right effort, building the right teams, you can get done, and an absolute unwilling nature. We're going to find a way to do this. We actually instituted a program to change the schools in Morocco from French as the second language to English. And they'd been wanting to do it for years, but didn't know how to do it. And here is a case, this may take a second, the Fulbright Scholarship Program, which is a fabulous program, which came at a time when our country had budget surpluses, which is how it came about. We're going to help educate, people from around the world. The Minister Delegate of Education in Morocco, Moroccan gentleman, Driss Ouija, was a graduate, got his PhD at the University of Texas. And together, after a number of meetings, we found a way. He told me what he needed. I would go in and not tell people what I wanted from them. I would say, what do you need from me? How may I help you? And we need to have some urgency. And it's really the spirit of we're going to get it done.
So I have two questions here for Ambassador Rakolta. So you mentioned soft power. Can you just tell us in a nutshell, what do you mean?
Soft power is the ability to find common ground on mutual things that you like. Art, literature, music, film, TV. In our particular case, ambassadors are allowed to take art out to their embassy or to their residence to talk about, for instance, art here in the United States. We chose not to do that. My wife and I chose instead is to start with a blank slate and buy art in the Middle East and bring it into the ambassador's residence. My wife got global accolades on the art collection that she collected over the 2 years or about where we were there, bought 70 pieces of Middle Eastern art from all countries, put them on the walls with the theme of transcending conflict. And that theme ended up intersecting with the Abraham Accords theme of peace and prosperity. And all of a sudden, overnight, this whole thing blew up in a very, very good way and began to bring all kind of interlocutors into the ambassador's residence to try to figure out better ways that we can connect as societies.
So I'm looking out here, and I see some students in the audience, and I know there's probably some students tuning in here. We're about to wrap this up, but before we do, is there something you would share with the young person here who's looking at the career and the world ahead of them, starting out, new startings and new beginnings? What piece of advice would you give a young person who's interested maybe in emulating, following in the kind of career you've had where you've dabbled in, you're going in politics a little bit from behind the scenes and also with business? And what advice would you have for a young person?
Get involved. Work hard. Don't quit. There are so many things that are open to you that people need your help, need your support, be it time, money, effort, but don't be afraid to get involved. And that's basically how John and I wound up where we were. We've been involved, we've done this for a long time, and it's really very fulfilling. And I do want to say one thing. I do believe in John mentioned Terry and what a fabulous job she did. I believe the people of Morocco will remember Jennifer longer than they will remember me. But she used to drive around Morocco in her Ford Explorer with diplomatic plates and go anywhere, do anything. And it's having a partner that you can trust that will do those things and do them well or better than I would.
I support 100% of what he said, and I'll add some soft skills that all these young people need to develop. I call them the 4 C's. First is critical thinking, the ability to be able to think outside of the box, because that's where you're going to find the solutions to the problems of today. Second, communication. You have to develop your communication skills both verbally and in writing. If you can't communicate, you cannot progress. Third is creativity. To be creative is how you find these solutions. You add those communication and critical thinking skills to creativity. You end up having all of what's necessary, and then you wrap it in the final C, which is collaboration. You can't get anything done today unless you have a team.
I know when we started this, we chatted a little bit ahead of time about things, and I know there's so many different questions and issues. We could talk about this for about the next 3 hours, but I know time is short. So let me ask you this way, as we're going to wrap this up. If there's a closing comment or point you want to reinforce that's important for people to hear, what would that be? If there's a comment, it can be about anything, about the Abraham Accords or whatever. Let me flip one of these coins over here.
Well, no. I think that again, it was such an honor to represent our country. I will remember that all my life. Jennifer and I talk about it. We think about the things we did. John and I are both on the Abraham Accords Peace Institute. We were together in the UAE and Morocco last summer. We're going to go back. Our team was just in country in the Middle East last week. They got home over the weekend. There's lots going on, lots to do, but we're making progress. And that's a really wonderful feeling.
I would close by saying the United States of America is the greatest country in the world that has ever been. We need to take the positive out of what we do well. We need to fix what we don't do so well. But I would say that the most important thing going forward is a positive attitude about the future and about our ability as a nation and individuals to be able to make a difference. The one thing that I've learned my whole life, regardless of what I'm involved in, is one person can make a difference.
And since Ambassador Fischer, you mentioned the Abraham Accords Peace Institute, can you just tell people real briefly what that is?
Well, it's a voluntary group. While we have a paid staff, John and Terry, Jennifer and I are volunteering our time in it, but it's partially the next step. It's trying to bring trade and commerce and interdependence. We want to bring, Morocco has 52% of the world's phosphate used for fertilizer. How can we use that in conjunction with technology from Israel? We can go to the Sudan and farm. We can, growing crops in the Middle East is very difficult. How can we create dependence on each other, co-investment, relationships, so when there is a problem, they're used to talking? It's really, in bringing Jordan and Egypt into that, it's really about bringing the Middle East and finding a way to get to peace.
Anything you want to add to that?
Couldn't agree more. It is no longer about Israel and the UAE. Yeah. Their connection, their future, they have grabbed very hard and are making enormous progress. Is how do we do that with less countries that have not as many resources, not the infrastructure already in place? How do we bring them along? Because poverty is the breeding ground for terrorism today.
And as kind of putting a bow tie on this, when Dr. Orapeskevich started and talked about the importance and how these issues like Ukraine and the Middle East resonate here across the world and here at Michigan, to have two leaders who have been so involved in this incredibly important, these peace accords that you've laid the seeds for that, to see where this goes in the years to come. We're all going to be watching this and lighting candles and hoping this thing goes in the right direction as it goes forward. But it's just incredible to see how much Michigan's impact is around the globe, and you're two shining examples of it. So I want to thank our two guests here for sharing their incredible thoughts and experiences. Thank you for your service. Thank you for putting up with the approval process to become an ambassador. And
Carol, thank you.
Thank you.
With this, if John and I were up here, it wouldn't have gone so well. So thank you for bringing order to what we were doing.
Well, you know what the follow-up is. You're going to have to both come on Michigan Matters and talk about it on the show. And Dr. Orr will have to be there too, and David, and we'll do it. We'll have a big roundtable. And starting next week, I'm back in studio full-time in person for the first time since the pandemic. So we can make that happen.
Who's your guest? No.
Oh, for next week?
Next week. Can we talk about it? Maybe now.
You know, I can't say it out loud yet. I wish I could. There's so many things up in the air, but it will be about politics. I'll just leave it at that. Some people who are like on the fence, are they going to do it? Are they going to be here in town? So, but anyways, I'll write about it for the Free Press too. So thank you guys so much. And you've been a great audience. Thank you for the great questions, David. Thank you.
David, thank you very much.
Appreciate it. All righty. And everybody have a great evening. Safe drive home. Hopefully it's not snowing out there yet.
Oh, God, snow.
Yes.